The night remembers everything. It remembers the way she ran. The grey uniform plastered to her back, the black braid coming apart, one pin at a time, as if even the small things holding her together had decided tonight was the night to let go. She had been inside these palace walls for 6 months. She had scrubbed their floors, polished their silver, kept her eyes low and her breathing even, and she had become, as she intended, nothing. A shape in the hallway, a pair of hands, a girl with no last name worth remembering, 6 months, and tonight had undone all of it in a single wrong turn down a corridor she was never meant to walk. King Caspian Blackthorn stood in the rain, the way kings stand in everything, as though the world had arranged itself around him and he had simply agreed to occupy it. His jaw was stone, his shoulders a reckoning, and his eyes, when they found her face gold, wolf bright, and utterly, terrifyingly still, like something in him had stopped moving the moment it saw her, like something in him had been waiting. Caspian knew. Why does it always have to be you? She did not have an answer. She wasn't sure he was asking her. She wasn't sure he was asking anyone at all, only that old, unseen thing inside him, the thing that had been searching her out across crowded halls and candlelit corridors for 6 long months, always finding her, always coming to rest on her face like it had arrived home. She had come here to disappear. She had come here to be nothing, to be safe, to hold very still inside a borrowed life until the danger that had been chasing her since she was 15 years old finally lost her scent. But the Alpha's eyes had found her, every single time, without knowing why, and tonight, standing in the rain with his hands still holding her upright and the sound of her pursuers falling, finally, quiet, she was beginning to understand that disappearing had never actually been an option, not here. Not with him. The question was no longer whether he would find out what she was. The question was whether she would survive it when he did. This is how she arrived. No announcement, no history, one grey dress, one grey apron, and a name given at the servants' gate with the careful economy of someone who had learned that the less you offered, the less could be taken from you. Seraphina Vale, 22 years old, silver eyes kept low, always low, as if the floor of Ironmore Palace were something worth studying. She was unremarkable. She had worked very hard to be. 3 weeks in, a girl named Elara had appointed herself Sera's guide, her interpreter, and her primary source of unsolicited information about everyone within the palace walls. Elara talked the way rivers run, continuously, cheerfully, with no particular destination in mind. Sera gave her her last name, Vale, offered it the way you offer a small coin to keep a toll keeper satisfied. Enough to pass, not enough to matter. She kept everything else tucked behind the quiet surface of herself, where no one had thought to look. She had been running long enough that caution no longer felt like caution. It felt like breathing. She did not catalogue exits because she was afraid. She catalogued them because she had learned, at great cost, in a life she no longer spoke about, that safety is not a feeling, it is a calculation, and the calculation never stops. We do not yet know what she was running from. The night remembers, but Sera had worked very hard to make sure no one else did. The doors of the great hall opened the way doors open only when the person behind them has never once considered that they might not. Every servant in the hall felt it before they saw it, a shift in the air. The way pressure changes before a storm rolls in from the coast. Bodies straightened, heads dropped. The room rearranged itself, instinctively, around a single point of gravity. King Caspian Blackthorn, Alpha King of the Ironmore Pack, 26 years old, and already more legend than man. They said his wolf was the largest ever born to the bloodline, that when he shifted, the ground remembered it 4 days. They said he had not smiled since his betrothed died 3 years ago. They said a great many things about him in the servant corridors, in the breathless half-whisper of people who had never been close enough to find out for themselves. Sera paid none of it any attention, which was why she was the only person in the great hall who did not bow when he passed. Not defiance, simply distraction. A silver candelabra balanced in both arms, heavier than it looked, and a route to the east corridor that required she be exactly where she was standing. She looked up. She had not meant to look up, but something in the quality of the silence, the particular weight of being watched by something that has gone very, very still, pulled her gaze the way a sound pulls a head toward it. Not loud, not startling. The opposite. 3 seconds. Neither of them moved, and in those 3 seconds, something happened in his face that had nothing to do with a king encountering an obstacle. His eyes did not sharpen with authority. They did not narrow with impatience. They paused, as though he had arrived somewhere he recognized without knowing he had been traveling. He asked her name. She gave it. He said it back to himself. Serafina. The way you repeat a word in a language you have never spoken aloud before, testing the shape of it against your tongue, uncertain whether you are saying it right, more uncertain still why it matters. Sierra did not watch the king leave. She watched Drace. She had learned, long before Ironmore, that the danger in any room is almost never the loudest person in it. By nightfall, it had spread through the servant quarters the way fire spreads through dry grass, fast, hungry, and slightly out of control. The king had stopped. The king had spoken. The king had said a name. Alara arrived at Sierra's door with the barely contained energy of someone who had been holding a remarkable piece of information in her chest all afternoon and had run out of patience for the holding. Alara reminded her, in considerable detail, that the king had spoken her name twice, that his eyes had gone gold, that this had not happened to any servant in the recorded history of the palace, which Alara had, apparently, reviewed. Sierra said that nothing had happened, that the king had wanted her to move, that gold eyes meant nothing. She believed neither of these things, but she said them with the steady, flat conviction of someone who has practiced believing difficult things for long enough that the practice has become indistinguishable from the real. Her mother had pressed it into her hands at 15, in a room that smelled of wood smoke and fear, with a word spoken quietly over it, a word Sierra had never been able to repeat and had never tried. Her mother's hands had been shaking. Sierra's had not. She had not understood then why her mother wept when she saw that steadiness. She was beginning to. Now. The charm was the only reason she was still alive. She had never told anyone that. She had told Alara. She could not entirely explain why her heartbeat, if you were close enough to hear it, was not entirely steady, not because of the king and his gold eyes, and the way her name had sounded in his mouth like a question he already knew the answer to, not because of Drace and the long, filing away look he had given her in the great hall. Because of something else, something she had no name for yet, a feeling she had first noticed 3 weeks ago in the eastern corridor, when a door had opened far ahead of her and the air itself had changed, pressure dropping, like before a storm, like before something arrived that had the mass of a decision already made. She had been cold her entire life, occupationally, constitutionally, in the deep bone way of someone who had spent years moving between dark rooms and open roads. She was used to it. She had stopped noticing it the way you stop noticing the weight of your own body. But in the great hall today, standing 1 foot from the king, the cold had gone, not gradually, all at once, like a door closed against the wind, like something in her had recognized a warmth it was not supposed to want, and had moved toward it before she had given it permission. She pressed her hand flat against the charm beneath her collar, and told herself it meant nothing. That body's lie. That warmth is not safety. The charm was warm too. It was always warm. It had been warm since the night her mother placed it on her. And it had never once, in 7 years, cooled. Tonight it was warmer than usual. She did not ask herself why. She was not ready for the answer. The weeks passed the way weeks pass inside stone walls, without ceremony, without colour, one grey morning dissolving into the next. Sierra scrubbed floors, carried linens, delivered correspondence to rooms she was not meant to linger in. She was a servant, and servants are not seen. That had always been the agreement. Except for him, she felt it each time. Not his presence, exactly, but the change in it. The way a room reorganizes itself When a certain kind of attention enters it, the air in the corridor would shift, and she would know, without looking up, that he was there, and she would not look up. She had rules. She had very good reasons for her rules. The wolf in him knew. The man did not, and the distance between those two knowings was the most dangerous place in the entire palace, more dangerous than Drace's watchful eyes, more dangerous than the secrets she kept folded behind her ribs, because Caspian Blackthorn was not a man who tolerated confusion for long. After the dinner, the corridor outside the hall, late, the candles burning low, she was heading for the servants' stair when his footsteps came up behind her, unhurried, deliberate, the footsteps of a man who had decided to go somewhere without entirely deciding why. He told her she was still here. She told him her shift ended at midnight. He said he meant something else, that most servants found reasons to leave Ironmore, that the palace had a way of pressing on people until they went. She told him she was difficult to frighten. She kept walking when she said it. She did not turn around. He said he knew that she was difficult to frighten. He said it the way you confirm something you have been sitting with for a long time, not as new information, but as a thing finally spoken into the open air, as if the saying of it made it more real, as if it needed to be more real. She was 3 corridors away by then and could not have heard him. The night heard him. The night always hears. He came from the north on a morning that smelled of iron and coming cold. 12 wolves at his back, all of them pale-furred and silent. Arranged behind him, the way teeth are arranged behind a smile, present and pointed, and not quite visible until the smile opens to wide. Lord Victor of the northern packs. He was beautiful in the way that expensive weapons are beautiful, crafted for a purpose, pleasing to look at, designed to make you forget, until the last possible moment, exactly what that purpose was. He moved into the throne room, the way smoke moves into a room when a window is opened, effortlessly, and in every direction at once. Sierra was at the far end of the throne room. She had made herself architectural, back against the wall, tray in hand, water and wine at the ready, as much a part of the room as the stone pillar beside her. She had been doing it for 6 months. She was very good at it. Victor's eyes moved through the room the way his wolves moved, covering ground, cataloguing, assessing. They swept past her once, the way eyes sweep past furniture. Then they came back and stopped. He asked who she was. Caspian told him she was a servant. Victor said that was interesting, softly, almost to himself, in the tone of a man adding a new piece to a game he has been playing alone for a very long time. And Caspian, who had spoken the word servant with the flat dismissiveness of a man stating a fact, felt something happen in his jaw, in his shoulders, in the particular, involuntary tightening of a wolf who does not like the direction another wolf is looking. He had no language for it yet. He would not have named it possessiveness. He was a king, and kings do not possess servants, and he was, furthermore, certain that the girl with the silver eyes and the borrowed invisibility and nothing to him beyond the inexplicable fact that he could always find her in a room without trying. He was certain of this. He was wrong about it in every possible direction. Sierra, across the room, did not look at either of them. She watched the space between her tray and the pillar and made herself into stone. She was very good at stone. What she was not good at was the cold that had returned to her, sharp and sudden, the moment Victor's eyes had found her, as if something in her body had thrown up a wall, as if something in her body already knew what kind of man knew how to look at what he was looking at. He found her in the library at evening, a room that smelled of dust and old agreements, its shelves running floor to ceiling with the kind of books that hold knowledge no one living has needed in a very long time. She was reshelving. Her back was to the door. She heard him enter the way you hear a thing that does not want to be heard, which is to say, barely, and far too late. He told her she was not a servant. He said it matter-of-factly, the way you say the sky is grey, not as an accusation, simply as a thing he had observed and found it unnecessary to pretend otherwise. Her hands were wrong, no roughness. Her posture was wrong, no deference, and her eyes, when the lamplight caught them at an angle, were silver, not grey, not the tired, washed-out grey of a life lived indoors. Silver. The kind of silver the moon is on the kind of nights that change things. She stepped back. Her hand found the shelf behind her. Not for support, she told herself. For information. The shelf was solid. The shelf was an exit she could not use. She told him he was looking for something that wasn't there. He said he was looking at something he had not seen in 15 years. A half-blood, alive, in an Alpha King's palace. He said it very quietly. The quiet of it was the worst part. The way certainty does not need volume. He told her not to worry, that he had his own reasons to keep secrets. For now. For now. 2 words that are not a promise. 2 words that are a clock, set and ticking, placed on a shelf beside her, with all the casualness of something left behind and meant to be found again later. Sierra stood in the empty library, with her hands still pressed against the shelf. She was counting her options. She had 3. She could run, but Victor would know it for what it was. And a man who already knew what she was could find her again far more easily than she could disappear. She could expose him, but she had nothing on Victor and no standing to bring it to. And a half-blood's accusation against a Northern Alpha Lord would not survive the first hour. She could trust him. She set that option aside before she had finished thinking it. 3 roads, all of them bad, and her hand, pressed to the wood of the shelf, was shaking, just slightly, just enough to see, which she hated, because she had not let her hands shake in 7 years, and tonight they had decided, without consulting her, that they were done pretending. 2 nights ago, before Victor, before the library, before she had understood that she was no longer the only person in this palace who knew what she was, the door opened. She should not have opened it. In another life, in a life where she had been less tired, or more careful, or had taken a single different step, at the servants' gate 6 months ago, she would not have opened it. But the night remembers everything, and what the night remembers is this: she opened the door, and she saw, and she could not unsee, and that was the beginning of the end of the life she had built inside these grey walls. Wolfsbane concentrate. She knew it by its colour, and by the smell, faint, reaching even through the gap in the door, sharp and medicinal and terrible in the precise, specific way of things designed to end something that would otherwise be very difficult to end. Enough of it in a single dose to stop an alpha's heart inside an hour. Enough to make it look, to those who wish to believe it, like a natural failing. Drace told them the king would attend the moon ceremony in 4 days, that the vial would go into the ceremonial cup, that by morning the Ironmore bloodline would be over. He said it the way men say things in rooms where they believe themselves to be alone, plainly, without ceremony, without the performance of menace. That was the most frightening part, not the plan, the plainness of it, the ease, the way a man discusses a thing he has long since made his peace with. She could not go to the guards. Drace was the guard, the head of them, the one they answered to, the name at the top of the chain. She could not go to the court. She did not know who else had been bought, and a wrong guess would seal the king's fate faster than the ceremony ever could. She was a girl with a borrowed name, and a false life, and a secret that would have her executed the moment it reached open air. She had no standing, no rank, no allies inside these walls, except one cheerful girl who talked too much, and one Northern Alpha who had promised silence with a smile, that lived in the same neighborhood as a threat, which left one person, the only person who had the authority to act on what she knew, the only person whose death she was trying to prevent, the only person in the entire palace who could also, with a single word, on the strength of a single truth, destroy her. She had one choice, and she hated it with everything she had. She sat in the dark with the charm warm against her chest, warmer than it had any right to be, warmer than the room, warmer than the 7 years of cold she had carried the length of her own life. And she thought about her mother's hands, how steady they had been when they pressed the cord around her neck, how her mother had said, "You will know when, not if, when." The ceremony was in 4 days. The king's name was Caspian. His eyes went gold when he looked at her, Wolf bright and comprehending. searching for a word he had not yet been given for what he felt. Tomorrow morning, she was going to walk into his study and hand him the truth. All of it, or enough of it to save his life. And then she was going to wait, very still, the way she had been waiting in one form or another since she was 15 years old, to find out what it cost her. She had stood outside the door for a long time before she knocked. Long enough that the candle in the wall sconce beside her burned down a full inch. Long enough that she had, in her mind, turned around and walked away 17 times. She had not turned around. That was the only reason she was still standing there. Not courage, not resolve, but the simple fact that she had run out of other options, and her body had stopped pretending otherwise. She knocked, and before her knuckles had finished leaving the wood, his voice came through the door, low, certain, her name, said with the ease of a man who had known she was there for some time, and had simply been waiting for her to admit it. He told her he always knew, that he did not know why, that his Wolf went quiet when she was nearby, and that it had not been quiet in 3 years. He said it to the window, to the dark outside it, not as a confession, exactly, more as a fact he had been carrying alone long enough that the carrying had become heavier than the telling. Then he turned, and his face, without the public armor it wore in corridors and throne rooms and the company of other powerful men, was a different face entirely, older in some places, younger in others, the face of someone who had been ruling so long he had forgotten that ruling was not the same as living. When she finished, the fire was the loudest thing in the room. He did not move. He did not speak immediately. He stood in the middle of his own study, with the specific stillness of a man absorbing something that has rearranged the architecture of a problem he thought he already understood, and finding that the new shape of it is both worse than he expected and, in some way, he was not prepared for. Clarifying, he asked her to explain all of it, and not to leave anything out. She told him everything, almost everything. She told him about Drace, about the Ashburn, about the vial and the ceremony, and the 2 days she had spent with the weight of it pressing on her chest like a stone she could not set down. She did not tell him what she was. She told herself it was because it was not relevant, that he needed the information about Drace and nothing else, that the rest was hers to keep. The charm was warm at her throat. She had never been as aware of it as she was in that room, standing in front of that man, keeping the last wall of herself intact with the quiet, exhausting effort of someone who has been building walls for so long they can no longer imagine what they look like without them. He believed her. She could see it, not in any softness, but in the quality of his attention, the way a man listens when he is no longer deciding whether something is true and has moved on to deciding what to do about it. He believed her, and she had not known until that moment how much of the weight she had been carrying was the fear that Drace was not a man who waited. The moment word reached him that the king had called for new guard assignments, quietly, without explanation, in the particular bureaucratic language that means something has changed, and the person who changed it does not yet want you to know they know. Drace understood. He did not panic. He recalculated. And a man who has been building towards something for as long as Drace does not need very long to recalculate. He did not wait for the ceremony. He moved that night. Elara found them first. Elara, who talked too much and noticed everything, who had made it her personal occupation to know the position of every guard in the servants' wing at every hour of the night, because she had once been trapped in the linen room for 4 hours and had resolved never to be caught unaware again. Elara, who came through the study door at a run, chest heaving, with the specific energy of someone delivering information they wish they did not have. She declined. She said it plainly, without apology, and crossed to the fireplace in 4 steps and took the iron poker from the hearth with the calm, unhesitating decisiveness of someone who has been in bad rooms before and has learned which objects in a bad room are useful. He looked at the poker. He looked at her. Something moved through his expression that was not frustration and was not admiration, but occupied the precise territory where those two things live together. In a person you are not yet sure what to do with. He told her they were going to have A very long conversation. When this was over, she told him, "If it's over," and then she walked past him toward the door. And after one brief moment, in which an alpha king of the Ironmore pack stood in his own study, being quietly outpaced by a servant girl with a fire poker, he followed her. The corridors came fast. Guards met them at the east stair, 2, then 3. Grey cloaks and drawn swords, and the blank, committed faces of men who have been told what they are doing is necessary. Caspian's Wolf rose the way a tide rises, not all at once, but unstoppably, the gold flooding his eyes, and the size of him expanding in ways that had nothing to do with his actual height and everything to do with the particular, ancient authority that moves through alpha blood like weather. And Sierra, who had kept her head down, and her eyes low, and her hands folded, and her breathing even for 6 long months. Sierra, who had made herself into furniture, and shadow and borrowed silence, fought the way she had learned to fight in the years before Iron Law. In the rooms she no longer spoke about, not beautifully, not like a story, but effectively, with the economical, unornamented efficiency of someone for whom survival was never a performance. The corridors gave way to the courtyard. The rain was back. Of course it was. The night remembers everything, including the shape of the moment it has been holding in place since the very beginning, waiting for all the pieces to arrive. The courtyard, the same cobblestones slicked with the same rain, the same dark above, the same cold below, the same stone walls that had watched her running an hour ago are rearranged into a different configuration of the same problem, except that now she was not alone in it, and that single difference was either going to save her life or cost her the last secret she had been keeping. Drace was there. Of course he was. A man who does not wait, does not send others ahead and hang back. He comes himself, because control is the thing he cannot relinquish, and the courtyard was the last place in this palace where he still had any. 6 guards flanked him. Behind Drace's arm, Alara, pale and very still, doing the extremely difficult thing of staying quiet when quiet was the only courtesy that kept her breathing. "Don't give up the girl," he said. "And the king lives. Keep her. And they are both dead by morning." He said it with the calm of a man who has run this calculation already, and is satisfied with the arithmetic. He said it as though Sierra were a variable, a weight on one side of a scale, a thing to be surrendered or kept based solely on what she was worth to the man standing beside her. Caspian did not answer immediately. His wolf gold eyes moved from Drace to Alara to the 6 guards to Sierra, and then they settled on her, and something happened in them that had nothing to do with the calculation, nothing to do with the arithmetic, nothing to do with the long list of reasons why a king does not stake his life on a servant girl he cannot explain. He said she was under his protection. He said it with his wolf behind every syllable, the full weight of alpha authority, the kind that does not negotiate and does not reconsider and has no interest in being reasonable, the kind that moves through the air like a physical thing, the kind that, in the old stories, could stop a charge and drop a lesser wolf to its knees at 100 yards. He said it the way you say a thing you cannot unsay, not because you have decided to, but because the saying of it was never really a decision. It was an inevitability that had been working its way toward the surface since the very first morning in the Great Hall, when he had stopped 1 foot from her and felt his wolf go quiet for the first time in 3 years. The clouds moved, not all at once. The way clouds move when something larger than weather has decided it is time, parting slowly, deliberately, the way a curtain parts in a room where the light has been waiting a long time to enter, and the moonlight that came through was not the thin, polite moonlight of ordinary nights. It was full, white and total and absolute, the kind of moonlight that does not illuminate a scene so much as change it. In the scuffle, some moment she had not tracked, some hand that had caught the leather cord and pulled. The charm had come free. It lay on the wet cobblestones 3 feet away, and the moonlight fell on Sierra's collarbone where it had been, and what the moonlight found there had been waiting 7 years to be found, a crescent mark, silver bright against her skin, as though it were made of the same light that had just arrived to show it, a birthmark that should have been invisible, that had been invisible, suppressed since childhood by the charm her mother had pressed around her neck with shaking hands in a room that smelled of wood smoke and fear. A mark that every Wolf alive over the age of 40 years would recognize in their blood before their eyes finished seeing it, Moonborn, the last bloodline older than Pax, older than Alpha Law, older than the crowns that had been built on top of it over centuries of forgetting. A bloodline the Ashburn had been hunting for 15 years precisely because of what it meant, what it could undo, what it could unmake, what it had the power to return to the world if it were ever allowed to wake. And Sierra felt it, not as heat, not as pain, as recognition, the way you feel the ground after a long time in the air, a reckoning arriving not from outside, but from the deepest interior of herself, from the part of her that had been held under for 7 years by a small carved charm and her mother's grief and the very practical necessity of staying alive in a world that would not let her exist. The part that was not entirely human and had never been and had always known it in the bone deep, pre-language way of things that are true whether or not they are spoken. It was not a transformation, the way stories describe transformations, violent, rupturing, the body remaking itself in fire and sound. It was quieter than that. It was a door that had been held shut for so long the hinges had rusted. And then the door opened, and there was no drama in the opening, only the sudden, total sense of a space that had always been there and had been kept dark, and was no longer dark, and could not be made dark again. She was no longer entirely what she had pretended to be. She had not been, since the beginning. But standing in that courtyard, in the rain, with the moonlight on the mark, her mother had spent 7 years hiding and the charm in pieces on the cobblestones at her feet. She was no longer pretending, either. Not to anyone, not to herself. Caspian turned. He turned the way you turn when something you have been trying to name for 6 months has finally been given its name, not in surprise, but in the particular, shattered clarity of understanding arriving after a very long wait. His Wolf was not confused anymore. His Wolf was very, very certain. It had always been certain. The man had simply not had the language for it yet. He said one word. Just the one. Low, as if his voice had misplaced its usual authority and had not yet found its way back. Wondering, as if the word was something he had been carrying in his hands for a very long time and had only just realized it had a name. Shattered, the way things shatter not from violence, but from the unbearable weight of a certainty finally confirmed. You, he said. You and the night, which had been watching all of it, the running, the hiding, the 6 months of lowered eyes and borrowed silence, the charm and the corridor and the study and the rain, held very still, the way it holds still when a thing that has been true for a very long time has finally been said out loud, and cannot be unsaid, and does not need to be. Drace charged. He had been a soldier before he was a warden, and soldiers who have decided they have nothing left to preserve move with a particular, unencumbered speed, the speed of someone who has already accepted the cost and is only interested now in the outcome. He moved that way. Caspian met him that way. The alpha shift does not announce itself. It does not build. One moment there is a man, large, controlled, dangerous in the way that highly trained men are dangerous. And then there is something older than the man, something that the word dangerous does not come close to covering, something that operates from a set of laws older than the ones written in any throne room. The guards who had been waiting for an order scattered the way smaller things scatter when something vast moves through the space they were occupying. The guards who had more conviction submitted, not as a choice, but as a response, the way a body responds to cold or height or the proximity of something that the blood recognizes as authority before the mind has had time to form an opinion. On the far side of the courtyard, Sierra moved, not toward the fight. She was not reckless, had never been reckless. Recklessness was the first thing that killed you, and she had survived this long by knowing exactly which problems she could solve and which ones she needed to step around. Alara was the problem she could solve. She crossed the courtyard in a low, fast line. keeping the ring of combat on her right, and reached Elara in the time it took the nearest guard to decide whether to intercept her, which was long enough for her to have already decided he would not. She got Elara clear, and then a hand closed on her from behind. One of the Ashburn stragglers, heavy, certain, the grip of a man who was not expecting resistance from a girl in a servant's uniform. He received, in the brief and educational moment that followed, a great deal of information about the difference between what a person wears and what a person is. She drove her elbow back into his throat with the calm, exact precision of someone who has done this before, not often enough that it is easy, often enough that it is no longer a surprise to herself. He went down. She stepped over him. She did not look back, because looking back is how you die, and she had survived this long by knowing that Victor had been in the shadows. Of course he had. A man like Victor did not leave rooms. He relocated to the parts of them that gave him the most information for the least exposure. And he waited, and he watched, and he decided at the moment of maximum usefulness exactly how much of himself to spend. He had spent a precise and calculated amount tonight, not a gesture of alliance, a demonstration, a deposit, laid down in front of witnesses, to be drawn on later at a time and in a manner entirely of his own choosing. He told Caspian, pleasantly, in the tone of a man making an observation rather than a provocation, that Sarah would have made an interesting Queen of the North. Just so he was aware, Caspian said she would not be going north. Victor smiled, said no, he supposed she wouldn't, and then he left, unhurried, unrattled, trailing 12 wolves and a silence that had more architecture to it than most men's speeches. He would be back. Everyone in the courtyard understood this. Victor understood it most of all, and he wore the understanding lightly, the way he wore everything. Drace was on the ground. The courtyard was still. The rain continued, indifferent to outcomes, committed only to its own persistence. The guards who remained, the ones who had submitted, the ones who had scattered, were being gathered by hands Caspian had trusted enough to call for that night. The machine of consequence was beginning to turn. It would turn for a long time, but that was later. For now, the courtyard was simply a place where something had ended, and something else, less certain, less nameable, considerably more complicated, had not yet decided what it was going to do next. The palace had gone quiet in the way that places go quiet after violence, not peaceful, but emptied, as though the rooms had exhaled everything they had been holding and were not yet ready to breathe back in. Elara had been taken to the healers, protesting at a volume that suggested she was going to be fine. Drace had been taken to a room with a lock on the outside. The trustworthy guards, the ones who had spent 6 months being trustworthy without knowing they were being assessed for exactly this occasion, were doing what needed to be done with the sober efficiency of men who understood that the night was not yet over, even if the worst of it was and in the great hall, the same hall where 6 months ago a girl with silver eyes had stood 1 foot from a king with a candelabra in her arms and refused, by accident, to bow. Caspian and Sarah stood, alone, in the kind of quiet that is not empty, but full. The way a room is full after a conversation that has changed the shape of everything in it. He asked how long. She told him, since she was 15. The year the Ashburn came for the moon-born bloodlines, and her mother had pressed a carved charm around her neck in a room that smelled of wood smoke and fear and love, which is sometimes the same smell, and had not survived the night that followed. 7 years of running, 7 years of borrowed names and grey uniforms and lowered eyes and exits catalogued before anyone else thought to count them. 7 years of being cold in the way of someone who has suppressed the warmest thing about themselves because the warmth was the thing that would get them killed. He was quiet for a long moment after she finished. His expression moved through something that did not have easy words. The passage of a man who has just been handed the full dimensions of a thing he had only been holding one side of, and is turning it over slowly, feeling the weight of it, finding that it is both heavier than he expected and in a way that surprised him, exactly the right weight to carry. He told her she had come into his palace knowing what he would have done if he had known what she was. She said she had not had anywhere else to go, that he was going to be murdered, and she had found out, and she had thought, she said it the way you say something you rehearsed and then abandoned halfway through, that she could stay invisible, handle it, and leave, that it would be clean, that she would pass through iron more like water through cupped hands, and nothing would hold. He told her she was the least invisible person he had ever encountered. He said it without cruelty, without anything, in fact, except a kind of plain, helpless accuracy, the way you state something that has been obvious to you for so long you have stopped noticing that you know it. The sound of it in the great hall was like a window opened in a room that had been sealed too. Long, brief, unrepeatable, the kind of moment that does not announce itself as a turning point until much later, when you look back and recognize it as the first time something locked came slightly, irrevocably open. He told her his Wolf had known from the very first second in this hall 6 months ago, the candelabra, the wrong corridor, the 3 seconds where neither of them moved. He had told himself it was absurd. He had several extremely reasonable explanations for what he felt, all of them wrong. He had deployed them with great conviction at 3 in the morning on nights when the Wolf in him had gone still, and he had not been able to explain why, and had not been able to sleep for the explaining. An alpha king does not lose sleep over a servant girl he has barely spoken to, does not find her in a room before he finds the room, does not feel his Wolf go quiet, finally quiet, when she is nearby, does not. He had said that word to himself many times. It had not been especially helpful. She said his name, just that, no title, no majesty, no formality, none of the borrowed distance she had kept between herself and everything in this palace for 6 months. Just his name, Caspian, said quietly, in the tone of someone who has been carrying a word for a long time without knowing it was a word, and has now heard it in their own voice and recognized it. He told her he was not asking for anything tonight, that she had had enough asked of her, enough taken, enough demanded, enough of the world requiring things from her that she gave at a cost no one bothered to calculate. He was not adding to that. He was asking only one thing, that she not disappear, that she not do the thing she was very good at, the thing that had kept her alive for 7 years, the thing she had walked into his palace to do and had, for reasons she could not entirely account for, failed to do. He was asking her to stay. She looked at him, the way she looked at things when she was not performing looking, when she was simply seeing, without the lowered lash and the borrowed absence. Her silver eyes in the dying light of the wall sconces, the crescent mark still faintly visible at her collarbone, where the charm was no longer hiding it. The whole long careful construction of her, an invisibility, lying open around her like something she had finally set down. She reached up and pressed her palm against the mark, not to hide it. There was nothing left to hide it with, nothing left to hide it from. But the way you press your hand against something that has just become real, the way you make contact with the truth you have been circling for so long that touching it directly feels like arriving somewhere after a very long road. She said she had been running since she was 15. She said she thought she was tired. He covered her hand with his. The mark between their palms, silver and warm, the warmth that had been there since her mother placed it and had never called, and was now, at last, no longer hidden. Neither of them moved. The fire in the wall sconces burned lower. The rain outside continued its long, patient conversation with the cobblestones, and the night, which had been watching all of it, which had held the memory of every step, and every silence, and every lowered glance, and every gold-eyed pause in a crowded hallway finally, quietly, let it go. Not because it was over, because it had, after a very long time, begun. Drace was imprisoned. The Ashburn cell inside the palace, 3 members, 2 entry points, 1 vial of something, silver black that was quietly and permanently destroyed, was dismantled with the methodical thoroughness of an institution that has discovered rot in its own walls and understands that incomplete removal is not removal at all. It took 4 days. No ceremony, no announcement, the kind of work that gets done quietly, because the alternative, admitting, publicly, how close it had come. Elara was given an official palace position, head of household records, a title that had not previously existed, and was created specifically because it was the only role broad enough to contain what Elara already did, had been doing unrewarded for 2 years, and would continue to do regardless of whether anyone acknowledged it. She accepted with the barely contained radiance of a person receiving something they have deserved for long enough that they had almost stopped expecting it. She told Sarah it was the best day of her life. Then she revised that to the second best. Then she said she would get back to Sarah on the final ranking once she had processed the full emotional landscape of the week. Victor sent a note. It arrived on the 3rd morning, carried by a courier in northern grey, who handed it to a palace guard, who handed it to Elara, who handed it to Sarah, with the expression of someone who has already read it, is not happy about what it says, and has decided that the appropriate response is to hand it over and say nothing. The note was brief. Victor's handwriting was exactly what you would expect from a man like Victor, precise, unhurried, each letter placed as though it understood it was being watched. The North remembers moonborn blood. He had written, "So do others. Be careful, little secret." It was not a threat exactly. Threats have a specific architecture, a demand, an implied exchange, a consequence waiting on one side of a door. This had none of those things. It was a promise, the specific, quiet promise of a man who has placed a marker and is content to wait for the board to develop before he plays again. Victor was very good at waiting. She already knew this. It did not make the note easier to put down. And Sarah still wore the grey uniform. She had considered, in the days after, whether to change it, whether to mark the shift in some visible way, to wear the change she felt on the inside somewhere the world could see it. She had decided against it, not because she was hiding, she was done with hiding, but because the grey dress had become, without her meaning it to, the most honest thing she owned. She had arrived at Ironmore in it with nothing. She was still here, that deserved to be acknowledged by something. She still walked the same corridors. She still carried the same things from the same rooms to the same rooms. But she did not lower her eyes anymore. She had been lowering them for so long that not lowering them felt like a different kind of courage than anything she had done in the courtyard. Quieter, more personal. The kind that does not look like courage at all from the outside, but costs exactly as much on the inside. He had been happening to pass this corridor every morning for 4 days. She had been happening to round this corner every morning for 4 days. Neither of them had remarked upon the coincidence. Neither of them was especially convincing about it being one. Their fingers brushed as they passed, the way fingers brush in a narrow corridor between two people who are walking in opposite directions, and have not, technically, stopped to let it happen. They both pretended it was accidental. They were both, in this regard, very poor liars, which was something of a surprise in a king who had spent 3 years governing his expression, and no surprise at all in a girl who had spent 7 years governing everything else, and had apparently used up her entire reserve on the rest of it. She had pretended to be a servant. She had pretended to be invisible, unremarkable, a shape in the hallway, a girl with no last name worth remembering. She had built the pretense carefully, maintained it daily, and defended it with 7 years of cold and lowered eyes and borrowed silence. And the Alpha's eyes had found her, every single time, without knowing why, across crowded halls and candlelit corridors and rain-soaked courtyards and rooms she was never meant to be in, always finding her, always coming to rest on her, faced with the unhurried certainty of something that has been navigating by her light since the very beginning without understanding that light was what it was. Maybe, finally, she was starting to let them dot, and that, right there, is where part 1 ends. Sarah's secret is out. Caspian knows what she is. But here is the thing, he does not know everything. There is one thing she still has not told him. One thing her mother whispered in that room that smelled of wood smoke and fear. the night she pressed the charm around her neck for the last time. A thing so old and so consequential that it does not just change the story between Sierra and Caspian, it changes the story of every pack, every bloodline, every crown that has been built on top of the Moonborn legacy for 300 years of careful forgetting. And when Victor comes back, and he will come back, because men like Victor do not make deposits they do not intend to collect, that secret is going to be the only thing standing between Sierra and a war that has been waiting very patiently for exactly her. Part 2 is coming. Caspian's past, the betrothed he lost, and why that loss is connected to Sierra in a way neither of them has figured out yet. Victor's real agenda, which is larger and older and considerably more personal than trade negotiations, and the moment Sierra has to make the one choice she has been running from since she was 15, between the freedom she built her entire life to protect and the bond she never asked for and cannot walk away from. If you want to be there for it, hit like. It costs you nothing and it tells the algorithm this story is worth finding. Subscribe, so when part 2 drops you are already in the room. And leave me a comment with one thing. Do you trust Victor? Because I have spent this entire story writing him and I genuinely cannot give you a straight answer. And I want to know where you land. The night remembers everything. I will see you in part 2.